All right, so we finished up World War I, the First World War last time. Again, probably spent more detail on that, more time on that than you might get in other courses, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that the way World War I ended, the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, all of these various new countries, the political map of Europe changing, it sets up so many conflicts for the rest of the 20th and now 21st century. I didn't even show you the one map, kind of interesting. It also affected, just as a side note, you have to write this down, but as a side note, part of the Treaty of Versailles created new countries in the Middle East. That old Ottoman Empire, which had been on the side of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, they lost. And the Ottoman Empire was broken up as well. And out of that comes some very interesting new countries like Palestine, Jordan, Iraq. Iraq is an artificial country created in the aftermath of World War I. And this was a moment where the representatives of the Big Three, remember I mentioned a man named Winston Churchill. He was the Minister of the Navy during World War I for Great Britain. He'll go on to become Prime Minister during World War II. He did get out the magic marker and drew a boundary around three groups of people in the Middle East. He said, gee, let's include the Kurds and the Sunni Muslims and the Shiite Muslims, and let's put them all together in one country. Coincidence? No, there are no coincidences. Why would he do that?
To ensure conflict.
To what?
To ensure that there will be conflict in the region?
Absolutely. That is, he said, they will be. Do these people like each other?
No.
Not exactly. Okay? He said they will be so busy fighting each other that they will not challenge their British overlords. Right? So consider, again, the way the First World War ended sets up many of the international conflicts of the 20th and now 21st centuries. All right? Okay. The other thing I might say, just as we start, let's get a sense of the 1920 presidential election. I'm not going to focus on any one of these presidents. We're not a fan of the presidents of the 20s? What? I'm just going to sort of talk about them in general because they're more or less interchangeable Republican talking heads. They all follow basically the same principles, and they're all Republicans, right? But let me sort of put this particular election in context, 1920. Right? Warren G. Harding ran under a campaign slogan in which he was calling for a, quote, return to normalcy. Look that word up in your dictionary. It doesn't exist. It's not a word. And yet we all understand what the intention is behind, what he means by it, right? Consider that this is the aftermath of the First World War we're talking about here. This was an absolute failure on the part of the purpose of the war, right? Make the world safe for democracy. The League of Nations, we're the only country that didn't join the League of Nations. A lot of Americans are sitting there scratching their head, goes, what was the point of all of this, right? Well, a lot of businessmen and weapons manufacturers made a tremendous amount of money, and to a large degree, that is going to influence perception of what the purpose of this war was all about in the minds of a lot of Americans. Keep in mind, too, that this war saw the death of about 9 to 10 million people. And in 1919, we have a worldwide flu or influenza epidemic. Now, this influenza epidemic, just kind of, remember how we all freaked out about swine flu a couple years ago and closed down schools and shut down? Did we overreact with that?
No.
You never know if we did or not, right? That's the problem. But the reason we take those things so seriously is like what happened in 1919. Roughly speaking, in the United States, about 50,000 people die every year from influenza. Mostly elderly people, right, or people with illnesses. Sometimes it's small children. But in 1919 into 1920, the conservative estimate was 20 million people died from influenza around the world. 20 million. And that's the conservative estimate. There are estimates that say it was much higher than that. Right? So put that also into this context, this disillusionment with the war, the battlefield deaths of 9 to 10 million soldiers, perhaps 20 million people dying of influenza around the world. This was an age where the American people just wanted to return to normalcy. Let's go back to the way things had been. Let's go back to the good old days, right? Before all of this involvement in the war. Because look what this involvement in the world got us, right? So the Republicans are going to win simply because they're not Democrats, right? Meaning that who is ultimately responsible for this war? Who's going to take the blame? The Democrats take the blame because Wilson, as a Democrat, is the president during this conflict. So I don't care who you ran against the Democrats in 1920, they were going to win. Yeah.
Did you say 50,000 people died just in the U.S. and 20 million?
No. I'm saying on average today about 50,000 people died, to give you a sense of a frame of reference. In the United States, it was about a little over 600,000 people died from influenza in 1919 into 1920. 20 million around the world, right? By the way, where did this flu epidemic, where do we trace the origins? Well, sometimes it's called the Spanish flu, except the Spanish don't like that, so they're going to call it the French flu, right? So they kind of started in the United States, started in military barracks in the Midwest, right? That's where it came from. So we exported that as well as all kinds of other. Right. So Warren G. Harding ran for president in 1920, won a landslide election, and I'm going to talk about all of these guys sort of collectively as Republican presidents. But he died in office in 1923, and his vice president Calvin Coolidge took over. Coolidge then ran on his own in 1924 and won. And he is the president during the middle 20s. And then probably the most talented of these three Republican presidents was Herbert Hoover, who won in 1928. Now, Herbert Hoover had been Secretary of Commerce. He had actually been rather instrumental in feeding millions of Russians during this Russian Civil War in the early 20s. He is known as an international humanitarian because he was able to orchestrate tremendous relief efforts to prevent widespread famine during this civil war that's taking place in Russia. Right? Remember the Bolsheviks, they are slowly winning and going to create the communist Soviet Union, right? But that's a very bloody civil war. And the irony of this is he is this international humanitarian, but he's also the president when the Great Depression hits the United States. And his response, it's not the job of the federal government to take care of the people of the United States, right? So this is going to be a huge backlash then, right? Because when you're in office and good things happen, you get credit. When you're in office and bad things happen, like Wilson and the Democrats with the end of World War I, the Republicans are going to take the political hit for the Great Depression as well, and that's going to orchestrate a whole new political realignment where the Democrats are going to run things, or at least be the dominant party, for the next 50 years throughout most of the mid-20th century with the rise of Franklin Roosevelt. Right? So this is kind of where we're going here over the next couple of lectures here. Well, all of these guys, as I said, are Republicans. Okay? So instead of focusing on any one of them, because they're pretty much interchangeable parts of an overall political philosophy, let's consider why they won as a whole. Well, the first point is probably the most important one, and that is that the Republicans have been winning since Lincoln. Right? And the only reason that Wilson had really won the election of 1912 is that the Republicans had split their vote. They had divided between Taft and Teddy Roosevelt, and as a result, the Democrats won. Well, now they have reunited and kind of got the act back together, right? To a large extent, this is also the end of the progressive era, right? Progressivism, this domestic reform program throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century, this sort of, remember, it was like the catalyst for that was that merger boom at the turn of the century, the rise of big business and the fear, or at least anxiety, uncertainty, what that would cause. This was, again, this, in terms of progressivism, governmental activism, this idea of getting the government involved to fix problems or perceived problems. But the problem is that it's 20 years we've been doing this. I would sort of suggest that it's more amazing that we continued it for 20 years than the fact that it actually ended. We tend to get bored rather quickly with movements like this, and this, to a large extent, faded out because the public was simply exhausted, meaning that they're tired of it, right? Now, on the other hand, when I say public exhaustion, I think I have this. Let me see. Never mind. Let me come back to that. The other thing that you also have to consider is why progressivism tended to fade out. One is that World War I is going to take the highlights and spotlight in the last half of the second decade there. But also because the progressives had accomplished a lot, right? You remember, they had the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment, 18th Amendment, 19th Amendment. We had the Federal Reserve System. We had the Federal Trade Commission. There was a tremendous amount of accomplishment on the part of the progressive agenda, right? Now, on the other hand, so again, I think they were kind of burnt out on it, right? But on the other hand, how much had people's lives actually changed as a result of all that reform? Not a lot, right? Oftentimes this reform is really just window dressing to maintain the status quo. You kind of give out concessions here and there to prevent widespread, public unrest and perhaps, conflict. But in the end, society is still more or less humming along as it always had, right? So Republicans are going to, no politician is going to call themselves a progressive. Even if they act like progressives, they're just not going to use the word, right? Now, the other thing that happens, and this may be the most important reason for all of this, is that the 1920s is the most prosperous decade in American history up to this point. Fabulous wealth. A lot of it created from the way the First World War ended. Tremendous boom time during the war, buying all of those weapons and war-related materials. And what we're going to see here is that is going to be, the profits from the war are funneled back into industrial activity and sort of an overhaul of industrial capabilities, in which we were really good at making stuff before the 20s. We get even better at making stuff. So it creates this massive prosperity here. It takes about 1922 for it to really kick in, right? Kind of really a transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. But we have this tremendous boom. And when we're in a boom cycle, people tend to keep voting for who they believe is creating that, and that was the Republicans, right? So again, it doesn't really matter which, we'll talk about this later when we get to the Great Depression, but just to kind of give you a sense of this with the stock market in the 1920s, right? No regulation, lots of speculation, but it's sort of an anecdotal sort of situation. There was, what kind of stocks should you buy in the 1920s? And the response was, it doesn't matter. There's a Republican in the White House. They're all going to go up, right? That's the mentality of the 1920s. Now the problem with that is when it goes up, it's going to come back down even harder, right? But they get the credit for all of the economic recovery, right? Even if it's short term. Identification with big business, as we said, that whole progressive era had been spawned by fear of big business or uncertainty. What did this mean? A reduction in competition, a reduction of individualism, and sort of big picture American values. It turned out that perhaps big business wasn't quite the boogeyman people thought it was. To some degree, it was the driving force of the American economy. It was the future. And while, again, there's still going to be lots of corruption and unions still don't have the right to strike or to even really have legal protection, the Republicans have always identified themselves with big business, and because big business was not seen as frightening as it had perceived been in the progressive era, they're going to benefit from that as well. And here's just a sentiment, of the 1920s that I think in many ways sums up much of American history, right? This is the president speaking here, right? The business of America is business. This is what we're good at, right? Making money. And, when your president talks about, American factories are the new temples where Americans go to worship, you have a mindset here which really praises the wealth and the sort of economic possibilities that American businesses are capable of. So again, this is why the 1920s is going to be so incredibly prosperous. But we always will have to come back when we get to the Great Depression. How many people are sharing in that wealth? How many people are actually participating in that? Right? Not many, or not as many as we might think. Right? which it kind of sets us up for a fall in the Great Depression of the 1930s. And you can always count on the Democrats to shoot themselves in the foot. They're very good at this, right? Self-destruction of the Democratic Party. And the problem for the Democrats is they are really fragmenting over sort of two separate parties. Now remember, the Democrats have always been a fragmented party, like today, right? Lots of causes, lots of agendas, not a lot of focus, and so it's kind of hard to sort of gravitate to one or two talking points here. But the Democrats are becoming increasingly two parties. You have in the North urban Democrats. A lot of the immigrants coming over to the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century, they're going to northern cities looking for factory jobs. Many of them tend to be Democrats, and the problem is that what's going on in the South, which has been the long-standing sort of power base of the Democratic Party, these are more rural Democrats. So, again, how do you find one national candidate that both the Northern and Southern Democrats can agree upon? Well, it's very difficult, right? Because they really are a splintered party here. Okay, so all of this together is why the Republicans absolutely dominated the 1920s. Okay. Now, what did they do? And again, I'm focusing just on their policies, not one particular president here. But I do draw your attention to this one policy that all Republicans adhered to: protective tariffs. It was, again, a tariff is a tax on foreign products coming into the United States. A protective tariff is a high tax on products or imports coming in to the United States. So we saw under Wilson, liberal Democrat, liberal meaning liberate the economy, liberate the market, expansion into foreign markets, which means you got to have lower tariffs at home so that countries you're trying to get your products in won't also raise taxes on your products, right? So Wilson had lowered the tariffs. As soon as the Republicans take office again, not just high protective tariffs, record high protective tariffs. Some products have a 40% tax. 40%. It's unheard of how high these taxes get. Now, here's the problem with that. They don't know it at the time, or they're not paying attention, right? But this actually sets up some parts of the Great Depression. Because as I was just saying, if you tax your product, you tax foreign products coming into the United States excessively high, other countries are going to do the same. And if we're trying to stimulate the economy, having our products in other markets is going to be a big part of that. But we're going to see a reduction of our products' access to foreign markets because we put these record high tariffs. Okay? Now, why do they not realize this? Because we're having one of the most prosperous decades in American history, so you don't quite realize it because everybody is still making a lot of money. Right? Now, why are they making money? Well, we haven't got to it yet, but it's this thing called the automobile, which we're going to come back to. It's a boom cycle that really sort of it sort of hid the fact that we're not making money abroad. Excuse me. And again, I'll probably make comparisons here, make references to the Great Depression, and I'll say something like, well, had we done this or had we done that? I'm never going to suggest that we could have prevented the Great Depression unless we had a wholesale different economy. But had we done this or that, it might have not been as bad, right? And here's one of those things: had we had less, lower taxes here on imports, we would have had greater international markets, and it would have offset our, collapse of our domestic market, right? I'll come back to that when we get to the automobile. But record high protective tariffs. We also see immigration restriction, right? 1924, the National Origins Quota Act, which basically said that we will put quotas or limits on the number of people that can come to the United States from various countries, right? So we put a cap on every country. What countries particularly might we have a low cap?
Germany, East Europe.
Eastern Europe, right? Not Germany. We like the Germans. They can come over. Those are good Protestants, right? It's those Eastern Europeans. And why Eastern Europeans? What might they be?
Communists.
They might be communists, absolutely. So some of this is ideological. You want to sort of make sure that sort of contagion, that disease of communism, you don't want to bring that over here. So we limit the number of people that can come, particularly from places like Russia and Eastern European countries next to them. We have high cap on people coming from England or Germany or Ireland. They never meet those quotas, right? So again, this is obviously culturally selected here. But in general, what this reflects is the fact that after 2 generations of massive immigration, from about the 1870s to 1920, 30 million people came over. I think there's this sentiment that there are enough, right? We don't need any more people, right? And so we begin to restrict the number of people that can come over. And by the way, this is going to be very appealing to a lot of rural Americans, conservative Americans, because what you're ultimately restricting are, again, immigrants, Jews, Catholics, non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Right? The other thing that the Republicans do is, I say there's a lapse of regulation here. Now, this in many ways is a little misleading because the regulatory agencies, like, for example, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, founded by Teddy Roosevelt during the Progressive Era to regulate, again, the food and drug industry. It doesn't go away. These agencies aren't abolished. It's just that the Republicans appoint pro-business leaders to regulate, meaning that it's sort of like letting big business regulate itself. And when you do that, you don't have regulation. Right? They're formulating policy to benefit themselves. So it's a lapse in the sense of they're not going away, but you're putting people in there that are cooperating with big business. They're not really providing the oversight that is the intention of these regulatory agencies. Yeah.
Is this just like what happened with the oil company and the spill? The people inspecting the oil company was working with the oil company, so they kind of overlooked a lot of
Which oil
stuff.
company are you talking about?
The one that was offshore in the Gulf.
Oh, BP.
Right. There was stories saying there was people working for BP, inspecting BP, and they were overlooking stuff.
Yeah, this is going to be one of the big trends in the late 20th century. Is an overall, and who are generally the presidents in the late 20th century? Tend to have an R next to their name. A lapse of governmental right. That is, you put the the inmates are running the asylum, and don't be surprised when you have problems like stock market crashes or massive environmental degradation. Now remember, again, this is true of the Democrats as well. They're just almost as bad as the Republicans here because there's just too much money involved in this, right, on both sides. So there's a lapse of regulation, is what we're saying. Right? And that's going to sort of set up this kind of financial free-for-all throughout the 20s that there will be hell to pay later on. Did I get all that? I guess not. Okay, so those are some of the policies of the Republicans. And again, it doesn't matter which president, they all pretty much adhere to them. Okay? Now, what's interesting about the 1920s, again, politics and economics aside, what's interesting is the cultural conflicts that take place. This is what gives the 20s, the roaring 20s, the jazz age, these sort of conflicts. Particularly the conflict is a cultural war between small-town America and big cities. Small-town America and big cities, right? There's a cultural divide. And again, this is not unlike what we've seen recently, right? We had sort of the heartland of America, middle America, the red states versus the blue states, that kind of thing. So this is about culture, though, not necessarily politics, but culture, right? Small-town America versus big-time or big cities. Okay. Now, again, just sort of get a sense of what's happening here. We are increasingly becoming an urbanized society. Remember back to this idea of urbanization. By 1930, so this is kind of becoming complete in the 1920s, that more people are going to live in big cities than in small-town America, right? The driving force in terms of culture, in terms of mass media, that's the buzzword of the 1920s, mass media, mass culture, mass entertainment, right? Mass communication, all these sorts of things. The perceived values of America, where are they coming from? They're coming from the cities, coming from the cities, right? So there's going to be a lot of backlash here and sort of fighting going on between the two, right? So we go back to the 18th Amendment just to remind you that this was the constitutional amendment which made the consumption of alcohol, the manufacture, distribution, and consumption of alcohol illegal, right? Again, a truly sad day in American history. And again, the Constitution has no laws in it. You have to actually then pass a federal law. The Volstead Act is the law making it illegal to consume alcohol, right? Now, this was one of those movements during the Prohibition era. Again, you don't slide constitutional amendments under the door here. There was widespread support for this, cities and rural America together. Women's organizations, Christian evangelicals, big business, right, that workers were sick and hungover, and this is where a lot of these accidents were coming from. So there was a movement, a push here during the Progressive era to get this passed, which they were successful, right? But by the time you get into the 1920s, I think that many people, and I don't want to suggest that there was a blatant disregard for the law. This did curtail consumption of alcohol by about 60% in the United States. But where is that really? Where are we seeing the limitations, the reduction? It's in rural America. I think the big cities, they tended to kind of want a do-over on this, right? Like, well, maybe we rushed into this a little too much, and they begin to abandon their commitment to prohibition, right? So, again, images like this, these poor defenseless little bears being. So in the cities, what we start to see are speakeasies developing, right? So a speakeasy was an illegal underground bar, basically, right? Club, where you would go to consume alcohol and gamble, usually, right? They call them speakeasies because they obviously are not going to advertise and they're not going to put signs out. You got to know somebody that knows somebody, and you go to the back door and you kind of have to have the secret handshake there, and you whisper, right? You speak easy what the password is, right? So this was a way to provide alcohol, particularly in big cities, to people who wanted to consume it, right? And again, this is one of this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is, if you're a fan of Al Capone and the gangland violence, again, there's going to be a tremendous amount of, illegal activity in providing alcohol to people who want to consume it, right? But I think in many ways, rural Americans are looking at this, and they're like, wait a minute, I thought we were on board with this, right? Well, in fact, cities are going to distance themselves from this. And ultimately, in the early 1930s, particularly in the Depression, trying to stimulate the economy, we'll have another amendment, the 23rd Amendment, I believe, if I'm not wrong, that gets rid of this. But that's the Great Depression. Right? Okay, another really interesting cultural icon of the 1920s was the flapper. Right? Now, a flapper originally was a dress. Right? So it's these dresses here that these women are wearing. And you kind of get a sense of it here with just a slight breeze. They tend to flap in the wind. Right? So that's where the term came from. But increasingly, it is the women who wore these dresses that also become known as flappers. So flappers are young women in the cities dressing in very provocative fashion. This is going to be very controversial from the perspective of very conservative rural Americans, because this will be proof, evidence that the cities are corrupt, because they allow this kind of behavior to go on. Now, what kind of behavior are we talking about? What is she doing that's so controversial? Right? Well,
See her knees.
oh my God, we do not want it, right? Bad. That dress should be at her ankles, not her knees, right? So, way too much skin showing.
Makeup.
Cosmetics. Cosmetics is a big business in the 1920s. She's cutting her hair short, right? She's actually getting it cut at men's barber shops, a bob cut like that. She's probably drinking, smoking, dancing, and from a rural, small-town American perspective, the most controversial thing that she and her friends are doing, they're going out on the town without a male chaperone to watch over them, right? So this kind of behavior was just absolutely, unacceptable to small-town rural Americans. Again, it is proof that there's something wrong with the cities because cities promote this kind of behavior. Now, here's the problem with this. How many women, young women in the cities, are actually engaging in this kind of behavior? Very few of them. About 5% of women in cities dress like this or behave. 5%. So the vast majority of women in the cities are more or less, mostly conservative, just as people are out in the countryside, right? But why is there so much attention paid to this? Because this is out of the ordinary. This is interesting. This is headlines. This is Hollywood, right? And so we're not going to focus on the 95% of ordinary Americans. We're going to go for that 5% because it's shocking and it sells newspapers and it promotes a sort of lifestyle here that people are interested in looking at. But most women didn't do this, right? It's headline grabbing is what's going on here, right? So again, it's one of those things where perception and reality don't quite line up. And the perception by rural Americans is that every young woman in the cities was dressing like this, when in fact they weren't. Right? All right, another really controversial issue here is going to be the teaching of evolution in public high schools. All right. Now, again, just a very brief recap. Back in the 19th century, Charles Darwin published a book called Origin of Species. And basically, he was promoting an idea, a scientific theory, not just an idea, but a theory, that species within a certain ecosystem who have certain physical traits are better suited to survive in that ecosystem than other species that don't have those physical traits. And therefore, nature will select, based on these physical traits, the species that will thrive. And as a result, then we have this concept called natural selection. Okay? Again, we saw this from the perspective of, translate this to society. Social Darwinism, those who are best able to compete in the market are going to have an advantage, right? And so don't blame us if we're rich. We're just built that way, I guess, right? But what's happening here is that the teaching of evolution as a scientific theory was not an issue in higher education. In colleges and universities, it was taught in freshman biology classes. It was not a controversial issue. It's when you start trying to teach it in high schools, public high schools, that's where it becomes an issue. Okay? Now, why is it going to be in the 1920s that we have it become an issue? Because the progressive era, one other, again, you can only look at so many things here, one other aspect of the progressive era was we need to educate kids more. We need to put more into public finance or public education. And so there weren't a lot of high schools around before the progressive era, right? It was something like, maybe just a couple of 100,000 students went to high schools that were largely private or somewhat for pay. But in the 19-teens, the progressive era, we see an explosion of high schools across the country. So now we have a couple million young high school students. Well, now publicly financed taxpayer dollars going to teach evolution, this becomes a controversial issue, right? So they've been doing this in higher ed for decades. Now it's an issue because it's in public schools, okay? And this gets us to the most controversial trial of the 1920s, the Scopes trial of 1925. Dayton, Tennessee, 1925. Now, again, let me just give you a little background to this case, this court case. There's a couple of intellectual movements that we have to consider here. One, in universities and colleges across the country, we have a new movement called, it's a way to textually criticize books, and by criticize I mean just critically think about them, not necessarily complain about them, right? Called the New Criticism, right? It's basically a form of literary criticism in which it's a way to analyze texts, okay? And what the New Criticism was promoting was the perspective that if you're trying to analyze the Bible, don't analyze it from a literal perspective, okay? it was a book or multiple books written a long time ago in a culturally specific context that should not be understood literally. Okay? The best way to understand the Bible, according to the New Criticism, is that it is full of all sorts of, again, beautiful stories and poetry and tremendous amount of wisdom and sort of how one can live their life with, certain passages that we might consider moral codes. But trying to appreciate it from its own sort of context, that's the way you should understand the Bible, not literally. Okay? So that sort of movement coming out of colleges and universities is emphasizing a particular way of trying to analyze and understand the Bible, right? As you would any other text, okay? And in reaction to that comes fundamentalism. Fundamentalism. Now, that movement, fundamentalism, comes from a series of pamphlets written by Princeton theologians called The Fundamentals of Christianity. So, what were they doing here? First of all, just think about just the term fundamentalism. What does that term usually mean, or who do we usually refer to when we talk about fundamentalists? Who are these people generally? Extremists. Okay, that's exactly right. And usually on the far right. Now, again, it can be, again, we've probably heard the term Islamic fundamentalists in the last decade or so, right? So it can be any religion, but it's usually people who are extremists to the far right in whatever religion they adhere to. Okay? And so these Princeton theologians, very much unhappy with the New Criticism, wrote a series of pamphlets called The Fundamentals of Christianity, in which they absolutely stressed that you should understand the Bible literally as the Word of God. Right? So again, it's because you take that literal interpretation, that literal understanding, that sort of extreme version here, this is why fundamentalism is associated then with extremist perspectives. Okay? So basically what we have here is two competing ideas about how to understand the Bible. All right? And we kind of keep that in mind as we understand as we look at what's about to happen with this Scopes trial. So John Scopes, John Scopes was a biology high school teacher in Dayton, Tennessee. And the Dayton, Tennessee School Board had just banned the teaching of evolution in public high schools. You were not allowed to teach the theory of evolution in public high schools in Dayton, Tennessee. John Scopes taught evolution, the theory of evolution, in his freshman biology classes in high school. Okay? For that, he was fired, and then he is going to sue the Dayton, Tennessee School Board because it violated his academic freedom as a teacher. Okay? So this is the sort of basis of this court case. But we have to kind of let you in on something. This whole thing was a scam. The whole thing. The Dayton, Tennessee School Board had made the teaching of evolution illegal on purpose because John Scopes was going to teach the theory of evolution and cause this problem for him to get fired and sue them, and it would create this big controversy in court case, which would do what? Bring all kinds of attention, customers, media, hotels, food, restaurants, to Dayton, Tennessee, and they would be in the spotlight of the national media. So the whole thing was a setup to begin with. John Scopes actually coached his own students how to testify against him. Right? Remember when I was telling you about evolution? Or maybe say that. That would be good. Right? So the whole point was it's a scam, is what it is. Okay? But aside from that, what is actually, so that the outcome of the case is not important. He's guilty. He's fined $100, and he goes back to work for the Tennessee School. So the verdict is not, the official verdict is not the point. All right? But what they have done here is open up this big can of worms to where now those who are on the side of the teaching of evolution are going to go against those who are opposed to it and emphasize the teaching of creationism as expressed in the Bible. Okay? So what this really turns into is it's the court of public opinion here. And everybody is going to weigh in on this. right? And there's going to be a pretty interesting outcome here. Not from a technical standpoint. Again, he's guilty, $100 fine, no big deal. Right? All right. What is on trial here, in many ways, is fundamentalism itself. That's what's really on trial here. Again, in the court of public opinion. Now, on the one hand, this guy on the left, Clarence Darrow, he is John Scope's lawyer. John Scope's lawyer. And they are suing the Dayton, Tennessee School Board because this violates his right in terms of academic freedom to be able to teach the theory of evolution. So that's the principle here, is academic freedom. That's what Clarence Darrow is representing. Okay? And by the way, and I don't think I have this written down, but Clarence Darrow works for a brand new organization called the American Civil Liberties Union. Did I put that on the handout? Okay, it's on the handout there. Good deal. The American Civil Liberties Union. It's on your handout there. The ACLU. Now, the ACLU was a brand new organization that had actually been created in the end of World War I, having to do with protecting people's rights to free speech that was being violated by the Espionage and the Sedition Acts, right? Remember, if you criticize the government or try to interfere in the war effort, you could go to jail like Eugene Debs, right? So the ACLU was a fairly new organization designed to protect civil liberties, particularly constitutional rights under the First Amendment. Okay, so they too have an agenda. Clarence Darrow does in the ACLU here about academic freedom and civil liberties. Okay, now on the side representing the the Dayton, Tennessee School Board was the old cowardly lion, William Jennings Bryan, right? So he is this guy here on the right. With it, this is Bryan, this is Darrow. Okay, and what's interesting about this case is at one point, this is an image from the actual trial, Bryan is actually put on the stand himself, and Darrow questions him. Okay, now kind of get a sense of what is being represented by these two men. Okay, on the one hand, you have Clarence Darrow. He's modern. He's from the cities. He represents science. He represents civil liberties. He represents this idea of free speech and academic freedom. In many ways, what Darrow represents is, from the perspective of the values of the cities, he represents the future. Bryan, who, again, as I said, he's like this bad penny that keeps turning up, right? He's old. He's kind of over the hill. He represents that sort of old, very rigid, literal interpretation of the Bible, that fundamentalist belief of the Bible, literal Word of God. And he kind of represents, in many ways, the past. That's kind of what's happening here, right? Again, in the court of public opinion. Now, Bryan gets put on the stand, and Clarence Darrow basically asks him, a couple of questions, kind of setting him up, right? And then he asks him, he said, look, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but should we actually understand everything in the Bible as literally happening as it's written down? Is that how we're supposed to understand it? Or is it possible that there may be multiple interpretations of this? And he particularly, Darrow did, brought up the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, if you're not aware of what happened with this particular city, Sodom and Gomorrah were considered to be very sinful cities, and God is going to rain down fire upon them and destroy these cities. But the question is there at least one good man, one moral person here that could be saved? And that's, of course, is the story of Lot. Right? Now, Lot is given a warning that God is going to rain down fire upon these cities. Take your family and leave. And when you leave, don't look back. Well, Lot's wife, being a curious person, looked back. And what happened to her? She turned into a big pillar, a big pile of salt. Are we supposed to understand that literally?
I don't think so.
Well, again, it comes down to perspective, and I'm certainly not trying to challenge anybody's religious beliefs, but Bryan himself said, maybe not so much, right? That is, maybe there are a couple of different ways that you could understand the message here without actually believing that she was literally turned into a pillar of salt. Well, when he said that, case closed. That's the point of the new criticism. Is it's the wisdom that comes out of these stories, not the literal actions themselves, right? So when he basically admitted that there may be ultimately multiple perspectives here, fundamentalism became discredited. Okay, and to a large extent here. Now remember, Darrow lost the case. His client lost, right, because he did break the law. But in the court of public opinion, it was really the teaching of evolution and this sort of modern scientific, forward-looking, perspective and values that won the day, right? At least, again, in the majority of the minds of Americans in big cities. Now, does this mean that small-town Americans suddenly start teaching creation or stop believing in creation? Of course they do, right? But it slowly shifts away to where fundamentalists are going to have much less of an influence in the values and sort of guiding, sort of the American future here, right? So again, the Scopes trial, it really was putting creationism and fundamentalism on trial, and they ultimately lost, or at least became discredited, when Brian admitted that there were perhaps multiple ways of understanding or interpreting stories from the Bible. All right. Now, small-town America is not going to, just take this. They're going to fight back, and one example of this is the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan. Right. So we see, for example, that the Ku Klux Klan has had sort of three incarnations, basically, three phases of its history. One was immediately after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction era, when it was founded, right? Again, as a terrorist organization to promote white supremacy, which it still is. It never stops doing that. Its second incarnation is the 1920s. And then later, the 1980s will have a sort of a third sort of rising up of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Now, I think a couple things we should consider here. I think what this reminds us of, or should remind us of, is that too often we have this idea that somehow we learn from history. I mean, we don't have that idea, but this idea that somehow, there were problems in the past. We got rid of slavery, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, right? Where things are getting better, right? They're sort of like something like we're actually making progress, right? That was the whole theme of the progressive era, right? We're getting better, getting better, getting better. That's not how history works. It goes up, and then we go back, and we go up, and we go back. And this is why I always say, back to Ulysses S. Grant during the Reconstruction era, for all of Grant's, drunkenness and corruption, right? Again, not that he personally was involved in it, but his administration was. He was really one of the very best presidents we ever had in promoting positive race relations, right? And that was back in the 1870s, right? 1880s, right? So what we see here is that now we're going to have some backlash. And race relations in the 1920s is at an all-time low since the Civil War, right? It gets much worse. Lynchings go up, right? That is the public murder of African-American males. Remember that this too, again, segregation is still a constitutionally supported system in the South, where it is constitutional to separate people based upon race. And what we're seeing here is that the Ku Klux Klan has reinvented itself in many ways, because it's not just African Americans that they hate. It's a much more inclusive kind of hatred here. They hate Jews, they hate Catholics, they hate all of those immigrants. They certainly hate anybody that thinks that evolution is something that should be taught in schools, right? That is, notice that what they have done is sort of expanded their hatred here to include all of these, various groups that have come to the United States in the last two decades, or last two generations, right? Again, as part of that immigration movement, right? So this is one of the problems here, and this, and be very clear about this. This is no longer just a Southern phenomenon. 40% of the growth, and growth, I think they have officially about 5 million members of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. 5 million, right? About 40% of those numbers are not even in the South. They're in the Midwest, places like Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, places like that, right? Now, the other thing we might say about the Klan is this movement here, this sort of resurgence of the Klan, it doesn't last very long. It's really only around as a sort of big movement here in the 1920s because I think that there was a certain, how would I say this? It was kind of a fad to join the Klan, right? Particularly, again, in rural America, they've become very popular. I mean, again, they're sitting there marching in Washington, D.C. It's a very visible movement, right? That it was popular to be part of the Klan. And when you're talking about it from a sort of a fad or a fashion or a popularity sort of perspective here, oftentimes those things kind of come and go, right? And so again, just as quickly as it kind of rises up, it'll kind of fade out a little bit more when we get back into the 1930s. Now, I'm not saying it ever goes away. It's still around very much today, right? But in terms of this sort of visibility that it has in the 1920s, it's probably the highest it's ever had, right? And again, that's that kind of conservative, small-town, rural American sort of fighting back, counterattack to the dominance of the cities and these values that the cities are promoting. Right? Okay. Lastly, I want to maybe conclude here with a look at the economy, but how this has tremendous cultural significance and social significance, how the economy of the 1920s changes. And nobody more important probably in this process than this guy here, Henry Ford. Okay? Now, maybe before I get to Henry Ford, I have some information down on the bottom of your handout there that I want to highlight here, and then we'll talk about Ford as probably the most important part of the 1920s economy. Just kind of reiterate a point here that the 1920s is the most prosperous decade in American history, up to this point, up to the 1920s. And so much of that comes from the way the First World War ended. With the profits from the war, business owners took those profits and reinvested them back into their factories to become even more efficient. Okay? So there's an interesting term here. I don't have it on the slide, but it's on your handout, called a cost-plus contract. Cost-plus contracts. And what that term means is that during the war, the federal government promised, in terms of getting businesses to make war-related materials, right? That's sort of fight the war effort here, promote the war effort. If a business went into manufacturing for the war, they were guaranteed cost, that is the cost of production of whatever they're making, plus profit. Cost plus contract. So it was guaranteed profit. Okay? And the point of that is, if you're going to guarantee profits, who's not going to get into that action, right? And that's why you have this, again, it's to promote the war effort, but there is an explosion during the war. Again, we made a huge, huge killing, prosperity, during the First World War, right? And so that money is put back into their businesses, back into their factories. And so it's called the second overhaul of American industry, or industrial manufacturing. We just got even better at making stuff, much more efficient, right? And Ford is an example of this, right? It's the automobile that's going to be the key to all of this, okay? Here is Henry Ford's Model T. And with now again, automobiles have been around since the late 19th century, right? But they were sort of novelties. It's really during the war itself and production for the war, in terms of vehicles to fight the war, motor vehicles, trucks, light trucks, Jeeps, things like that, a little bit, that we're going to see this sort of explosion throughout the 1920s. It was something like, we're producing at about a pace of about 5 million cars a year throughout the 1920s, so that by the end of the 20s, we have somewhere around maybe 30 to 40 million cars on the roads. Okay? In one decade. This is just unprecedented growth. Okay? Because here's the importance of this car and what it does. First of all, it ushers in the third transportation revolution. All right? We saw one before with the railroad. That was the second transportation railroad. The first one was back in the 1830s with the canals. Right? But the automobile in the 1920s literally revolutionizes how we move people and goods and services around this country. Okay? So think about it. Before I even get to the car, just sort of look at its sort of impact on the rest of the economy. Like the railroad, it stimulates other industries, right? So we're talking about rubber, we're talking about glass, we're talking about petroleum, we're talking about metal, we're talking about iron, we're talking about plastics and synthetics and chemicals, right? So all of the raw materials necessary to produce these cars, those industries are going to be stimulated as well. Ford and other auto manufacturers are going to put people to work, obviously, so it's a huge employer of Americans, right? Now, also keep in mind, how else might the automobile influence the economy or cause the economy to expand? Aside from the automobile itself, what are you going to drive them on, right? There is an entire construction boom related to infrastructure. So you're going to have to build roads to drive these things on. You're going to have service stations and filling stations, and you're going to have 7-Elevens and Stop and Goes and all of these little convenience stores and restaurants, right? So there's a whole service industry that is stimulated by this. Also keep in mind, if I have an automobile, kind of back to this idea about construction, do I have to live so close to the factory or where I work?
Nope.
No, it creates mobility, but it also creates then
Suburbs,
absolutely right. I don't have to live in urban areas near my factory or near my job. I can live in suburban areas outside of the congested, dirty cities. And so there's a whole housing construction boom as new neighborhoods, subdivisions are also built, right? Impractical before the automobile, but now it's practical, right? So it's going to have all kinds of sort of, again, economic, social, and cultural developments here that are going to change everything, right? Now, Henry Ford is the master of the assembly line, interchangeable parts, mass manufacturing, right? And one of the reasons, just think about the price of that car for a second. That's not a payment. That's the car. $825. Almost everybody, or at least the majority of Americans, could afford this. And if you can't afford it, guess what? We have a whole new industry. Consumer credit, right? Financing, right? So again, another huge stimulus to the economy. And why are they so cheap? Why is he so efficient? Because you can have any color you want. That's black. Mass production. But guess what? That drives the cost down, right? Because we're all driving black Model Ts, right? So this is going to change everything. It's going to change everything, right? Here's an example what I mean of just how efficient Ford gets, right? Right around the sort of little after the turn of the century, the first decade of the 20th century, again, automobiles themselves have been around for the late 19th century. It used to take Ford about 14 hours for his workers to assemble one car. But and this is what I mean by that. Put your profits back into industrial efficiency, much more efficient in terms of, again, mechanized assembly lines. They used to have horse-drawn assembly lines, right? Well, now they're mechanized. We're talking about the big shift here is from steam and coal as a source of energy to electricity. Electricity is going to be the source of power for all of these factories now, which again is much more efficient, much more reliable. So it now goes from 14 hours to produce one car to where they're cranking one out every 93 minutes, about every hour and a half, right? And by the way, what does Ford do with all of these profits, in addition to revolutionizing or making his factory more efficient? Paid his workers. Paid his workers a lot, right? Again, right? $2.50 per day, $2.34 per day. Before Ford, he almost doubles that, in fact, he does double that, a little bit over, right? So how do you think people feel about working for Ford?
That's awesome.
They love it, right? Creates morale, they become more efficient, they're dedicated, they're hardworking. So what this is ultimately doing here is in creating better jobs, because he is a very efficient and productive company, corporation here, we're starting to see the increase of the middle class, right? That is the expansion of the standard of living, wages go up, salaries go up. Because again, they know You're going to take those profits and turn them right back. You're going to buy stuff, right? So here's what else happens in the 1920s. Remember, we started this process back in the 1880s, late 1870s, during industrialization, where I said workers serve two roles, workers and consumers. And we were shifting to a consumer-oriented economy. By the 1920s, that's complete. We are a consumer-oriented economy, meaning that if you want to know how our economy is doing, there's one major statistic. What is the consumer purchasing power? Meaning, can we buy stuff or not? If we can buy stuff, we're okay. If we can't, we're in trouble. Okay? And that's going to be one of the big problems that sets up the Great Depression, is that all of this big prosperity, tremendous wealth, increased wages, increased production, ultimately is going to see a crash in the late 1920s, and consumers will simply not be able to buy stuff. And when that's the case, it's a spiral down effect. The entire economy will be drugged down. Okay? The other thing we might say, just to wrap up here, and again, I don't have another slide, but this is, again, mass entertainment is huge in the 1920s. This is the era where newspapers, for example, started putting comic strips into their newspaper. So it wasn't just about news, it was about entertainment. Right? This was the golden age of silent films for Hollywood, right, in the 1920s. And are you leaving me? No problem, we're just kind of watching you exit here. Yeah, these are kind of plan ahead moments here. Okay, see why getting up is a problem? Because now we're all worried about your Scantron situation. Entertainment, right? Newspapers, right? This is the age of Babe Ruth. This is the New York Yankees. Baseball is huge, right? The number one sport, though, is not baseball. Horse racing. Horse racing. But boxing and baseball are all obviously right up there as well. This is the age when we talk about mass production, consumer-oriented economy. Automobiles important, cosmetics, rayon, polyester, plastics, chemicals, all of this, appliances, right? Appliance for the household cleaning. So these are going to also have a whole new area. If you got all these consumer products, you better have advertising, particularly geared towards women who are going to buy these products to clean houses, right? Interestingly enough, too, we also have a shift in attitudes about beauty. And what this has to do speaks to leisure time versus working in factory time, right? Prior to the 1920s, it was a sign of beauty if you had pale skin. And why is that? If you had a tan, what did it mean? You're working outside under the sun. Well, now, what have these people been doing for the last 2 or 3 decades? They've all been working in factories. There's not a lot of sun in factories, right? And if you have a tan now, what is it a symbol of?
Beauty.
Sitting out by the pool with leisure time. And this is where we start to shift, right? Particularly, again, for white people, the ideal beauty is somebody with a tan, whereas before, that had been a worker, right? Somebody from the lower classes. So, again, leisure time is changing. Entertainment is changing. The buzzword here is mass media, mass entertainment, mass communication. As I was going to say, too, to kind of wrap up, this was the golden age of silent film. Did they have the technology to have talking films? Absolutely they did. But the problem was that when they first started this, guys like Rudolph Valentino, when they began as silent film actors, it was all about looks. But when they developed the technology in the early 20s to have talking films, if you heard Rudolph Valentino speak, kind of diminished his stock just a little bit, right? So they actually delayed this technology because they didn't want to ruin these careers because of the money that was being made, right? The first talking film, 1927, the jazz singer, right? All right, so this is the 1920s. Again, much more we can talk about. Next time, the Great Depression. All this prosperity, it lasts 7 years.